Owning a boat comes with a number of perks, like being able to fling your favorite fishing rod around. And here's another perk. Geico's boat insurance covers your boat and your belongings. And with specialist support from agents that are as passionate about boating as you are, there's so much value that you'll want to high-five someone. But not while you're holding your fishing rod. That's a prized possession. So hold on tight with both hands and keep it covered through boat insurance. Get more with Geico.
3, 2, 1.
This podcast contains content that may be disturbing for some listeners and is intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised.
This is part 2 of the Wildlife Mafia from the case files of Patrick Haynes. I am Tracy Anderson, and this is Unusual Curiosity.
And saw Paul with his hunting knife eating the sausages, and without any warning, Paul took the knife and literally put it at Chuck's throat and said, "You're the man, aren't you?" Meaning, you're the conservation officer. Chuck was really good. He kept calm and said, "I'm getting the fuck out of your truck right now. I'm done. I don't need this crap from you." And started to get out. Paul said, don't worry. No, not a big deal. Let's go hunting. And that's when they went out and started hunting rabbits. That's how he learned to use his ferrets.
So is this a tactic of all of these guys? That's their thing? Like anytime somebody new's in, they threaten them and see if they crack?
Right.
Okay, so Paul and Chuck B are now hunting rabbits with ferrets. And that takes us into probably close to 1978, right? No?
Right.
Okay.
Yep. It does. Yeah, I mean, to give you an idea of just the tip of the iceberg, I mean, there was one episode back in February of 78 where Chuck went to another killer's house, and this time they were just buying meat. At one place, they bought 354 rabbits. They bought just a half a deer and 46 raccoons and 7 muskrats. The person that they bought it from is what Thomas referred to as his biggest provider of deer. And at that time was when Chuck was told by Thomas and the biggest supplier of deer that Thomas had cleared $200,000 the year before on wild game. To give you some perspective, in 2024 dollars, $200,000 is almost $1 million. That's how much he made
In 1978.
in 1978.
That's a lot of money.
That's
I mean,
all-
you're talking about a time when the average income was like 18,000 maybe?
Yeah, I don't
Something
know
like
what it
that?
would have been, but it was a lot more than I was making as an attorney. I can guarantee you that.
So Thomas, he's like the ringleader, but it kind of sounds like all these people are kind of on their own, doing their own hunting, and he's just going around buying the stuff from them. He's not a coordinator of like telling these people to go out and do this, but because he's buying the stuff from them, they're continuing to do it.
I would say that's generally correct, but what Tom told anybody he dealt with is that I will buy as much wild game as you can bring me. He was organizing him from that standpoint because he was the market.
Yeah.
Okay, he was the one that was making all of this happen and bringing it up to much more than just a mom and pop operation. Because what Tom would do, he literally had, I believe it was 3 or 4 garages that he rented from people in the Detroit area and filled them with freezers. He'd leave a little area in each garage because as he brought the wild game in, he had to skin it, he had to butcher it and bag it. He would do all that in these garages and then bag them and put them in the freezers.
So he's stockpiling meat to sell.
Right.
So he must have been quite a networker, though.
Well, he was a pretty organized guy. In fact, there was one point, Thomas eyesight was not the greatest. And he had really developed a liking for Chuck. Considered Chuck to become a partner because he started calling Chuck. Chuck would be with him 2 or 3 or 4 days a week. They would go out, they would set traps for raccoons. Next day they would go back, check those, and then they'd go to the various suppliers, the ones that were killing and storing places at their own homes or businesses, and gather all that meat, and then either take it directly to Detroit or take it to the garages for further processing before they took them to the markets. To show the organization, Tom had a book that he kept of all of his transactions.
Oh, wow, he is organized.
He was organized.
A ledger
and
everything.
All the names. And he had over 200 people in this book.
Wow.
That where he bought the meat and the carcasses from. And he had a couple of dozen stores in the Detroit area, markets, where he would sell it. And he would use a code for the names, but he, because of his bad eyesight, literally showed the book to Chuck when they'd be together to say, oh yeah, we need to go check on so-and-so, we need to go to this place to get this meat, we need to go there, we need to go to these markets to sell it, and so on. And they would go literally through the book and decide where they were going to go. And certain people were great gatherers of deer, others were big on getting squirrels, others were big on raccoons, others were big on deer and pheasants and everything else.
So in a very short amount of time, Chuck's become Thomas's best friend, essentially.
He did.
And he's getting all of this inside knowledge from Thomas. He's basically handing it over to him, saying, there must have been a great amount of trust, obviously.
There was a huge amount of trust because there was a lot of money changing hands too.
Mm-hmm. So was Chuck getting paid?
Yes. He would get paid in several different ways. He would get paid a percentage of what he delivered. So if he took 30 deer, quartered up to the markets in Detroit, and they would pay him $60 a deer. At first it was $50, and then it went up. A lot of times he would get half of that, and the other half would go to Tom. But to keep his cover, Chuck also was still trapping, and so he would take animals that he trapped and sell those as well, then keep all of the profit. But then it was decided between the feds and the DNR that they wanted to shake things up. They wanted to start getting people to turn against each other, so to speak. So Chuck and Rick, the Fed,
Rick also working undercover,
decided that they were going to corner the market on deer. Okay, so they started paying more. The two of them would go out on their own, go to these sources that were in Tom's book, and where Tom might pay them $50 for a deer, Rick and Chuck would pay him $60 for a deer. They decided to also get into ducks. They decided to get into fish. Fish got to be a really big thing. They got into working with people out of Ohio that were bringing in walleye, a lot of them coming out of Sandusky, Ohio. They would get this fish that were all obtained by gill netting, which was illegal in Michigan, and sell this to fish markets. So they were selling fish, they were selling meat, they were doing everything. And they literally were trying to put enough pressure on the various competitors, which now was Tom. They went in business against Tom.
Did Tom know that at that point, though?
He didn't know that for sure. But he was starting to get suspicious. They didn't know Rick as well as they knew Chuck, because Rick wasn't undercover as much as Chuck. Chuck started drinking pretty heavily, gained a bunch of weight, got a bigger and bigger beard, a bigger and bigger stomach, to a point where if you didn't know Chuck really well, you might not recognize him if you'd only seen him once or twice before he had transformed himself. You wouldn't recognize him. And in fact, to digress a little bit, one of the things that was really interesting was Tom and Chuck were out getting raccoons out of the traps that they had set. They ran across a couple of deer and shot the deer, had them in the truck. They got stopped by a DNR officer. You can imagine Chuck's thought process when he's sitting in a truck with Tom and the lights are on the patrol car behind their truck. They're being pulled over in Livingston County. And they were arrested. They were literally given tickets. They weren't taken in custody. They were given tickets and had to appear in court in Brighton.
So Chuck, DNR officer, arrested, goes to court. Is he using his real name?
No.
Same name that he uses? Okay.
No. But, interestingly enough, because Chuck had been a DNR officer for a long time at this point, he had been in that courthouse on multiple occasions, knew the clerks, knew the judge, and he is scared to death.
Oh, my.
Because he knows that he has to go to this courthouse and maintain his cover, or the whole thing is going to collapse, the whole undercover operation. So they do. He walks in the courthouse thinking, I'm going to be busted. Somebody is going to say, oh, hi there. How are you? I haven't seen you in a long time. But he'd gained enough weight. He had this big, heavy beard that none of the court staff recognized him. He went in front of the judge, a judge that he had stood before on multiple other occasions with people that he had arrested for poaching.
Wow.
And now he's standing in front of the same judge. Judge Gee was his name. Judge Gee looked at him, thought he recognized him, thought this is really strange, didn't say a word because Chuck was standing next to Tom. So the judge figured something was going on. And luckily for Chuck, even though nothing would have happened to him in there because he was in a courthouse with deputies there, the judge said that pay a $75 fine and leave. So they walked out of the courthouse. Tom turns to Chuck and says, that judge is so fucking stupid. He said, we're just going to go out and kill a few deer this afternoon and that'll take care of the fine.
Wow.
And so that's what they did. So it was quite an episode for Chuck, thinking, what am I going to do in this courthouse that I've been in uniform lots of times?
That would be scary.
Yeah.
Very scary.
And what he was most afraid of then was, did he pull it off?
Yeah.
What is Tom going to think? Is he going to wait until we're out in the field someday and I'm not coming home?
Yeah.
Well, it turned out that Chuck was a pretty good actor. And nothing happened. Nobody brought it up again for about 2 weeks. Chuck and Tom were at one of the supplier's houses. And for some reason, Chuck still had the receipt from where he paid the fine in the back pocket of his pants. And somebody saw it. Said, did you get busted? Chuck said, yeah, I can't believe it. Yeah, they arrested me. I had to pay a fine of $75. And they just laughed. They thought that was funny. But it made Chuck feel, okay, I pulled this off.
Yeah.
This is okay.
It kind of gave him more leverage in a way.
It really did. It really did. So we're about in the springtime now of 78. They had been, selling this meat, selling the fish, selling the ducks. But they wanted to get more what they call spring ducks. This group decided, okay, we're going to get into the Grand River and we're going to go duck hunting. They went to Onondaga, which is a small town, a little kind of southwest of Mason, still in Ingham County. What happened is they got in a boat and they drifted from this one bridge where they put the boat in down to another bridge. And in the meantime, it was about 8 miles apart. They shot 22 ducks, took them, butchered them, sold them. Nobody thought anything about it. But we'll talk later in this broadcast about that duck hunting.
This particular duck hunt plays a pivotal role in the outcome of this case.
About as pivotal as anybody could imagine.
Okay, so now we're in April-ish, 1978.
April of 78, late March, early April. That's when Chuck discovered that, again, how big this operation was. Because at that point, Tom told him, we need a house in the country. Tom wanted to buy Chuck's house in the country to process game because Tom's plan was he was looking to get at least 60 to 70,000 raccoons, over 200,000 rabbits, thousands and thousands of deer, and they needed a price to process them because the garages in Detroit were not sufficient to do that. And there was too much traffic going in and out of these garages that Tom had rented. So they wanted to buy Chuck's house. But Chuck wasn't in a position to sell the house. But that's when he realized that it's even bigger than Chuck realized. To literally take in 60 to 70,000 raccoons and 200,000 rabbits, tens of thousands of squirrels, thousands of deer, that this really was huge. And so not only was Tom making almost $200,000 a year, $1 million almost in today's dollars, some of Tom's big suppliers that were buying from the hunters and then selling to Tom, who then sold them to the markets, they were making over $100,000 back then, which was close to $500,000 in today's dollars. That's the kind of money that they were dealing with. So the DNR and the feds, because of the sheer scope of how much was being taken out of the wild, they needed to work out a way to bring this to a close. And the best way they felt to do that was to start competing against everybody. And I talked earlier about Rick and Chuck wanting to go in, kind of cornering the market. Well, there were several people that were trying to corner the market at that point. There was a guy out of Jackson who was a big competitor to Tom. This guy literally walked around with thousands of dollars in cash in his pocket to be able to pay the hunters for the meat. And then he would take it primarily to Chicago and sell it. So they wanted to put this guy from Jackson out of business. They wanted to put Tom out of business, but they had to kind of keep it secret. Chuck and Tom were very close at that point, and Tom started to not feel comfortable with Rick. And so what happened was Tom was making anonymous calls to the DNR saying that this guy is out poaching wild animals. You need to do something about this. Talking about Rick. Trying to get Rick busted. What I haven't mentioned before, the law enforcement was pretty sophisticated. They had Chuck wearing a wire a lot. So they had Tom's voice on recordings. They had built into Chuck's Jeep photographic equipment to take pictures with hidden cameras. Well, the voice on the anonymous call matched the voice on the recordings, so they knew it was Tom. And things started to come to a head when Tom and a couple of other people felt that Rick was an undercover agent. And so they, because they were angry at Rick for trying to corner the market and that he was probably an undercover agent, looked for a way to take him out. In fact, Tom called Chuck and said, we need to get together. Let's meet at a certain location. Don't bring a gun and don't have any wild game with you. Which was the strangest thing that Tom had ever said.
Was Chuck worried at this point?
Chuck was worried that something was going to happen to him. But he met anyway. And that's when Tom said, we need to do something about Rick. We are going to have him meet up with somebody, and some of my guys will be there, and we'll take care of Rick. So now this is getting to be fall of 78. And the hunting operation was so big by this point. So many wild game were being harvested, and now they were out to get an undercover agent, and they needed to look at a way to bring this to a close. One of the things, I should have mentioned this earlier and I didn't, it was surprising at how many women were involved. It wasn't all men. The hunters were all men. The thing that I remember so clearly was one episode, and this is late into the undercover operation. Chuck went to one of these people's house to pick up deer and raccoons and rabbits. And he got in this conversation with that supplier. And in fact, actually, there were two suppliers there. And they were just talking about, we've been really good. We have gotten so many deer. We've got so many rabbits. It's been a great year. Our wives love it. And Chuck said, what do you mean? Your wives love it? Both of these guys said, our wives get so turned on when they're out with us and they see us killing animals. It just gets them going.
That sounds disgusting.
Isn't that disgusting? It is. But it was getting that wild. They knew they had to bring this to a close. So in December of 78, they tried to set up the undercover fed. Luckily, Chuck was able to warn Rick, because Rick had gotten a call from Tom saying, you need to be over at so-and-so's house. He's got some stuff to sell you. Well, Chuck got a hold of Rick right away and said, you can't go to that house. You probably won't come back out. So
was Rick aware at this point that they thought he was an undercover officer?
That was highly suspected at that point. And so what happened was Rick was all set to meet him, go to the house, gets the call from Chuck, calls back the people that he was supposed to meet and say, something's come up. I can't meet with you. We'll have to do it another time. And he could tell that they were not happy about that at all. And he sort of just backed out of the equation and just wasn't around. Everybody still felt comfortable with Chuck. So business continued on, and because Rick was gone, things settled down. There was the competition, the trying to put people out of business wasn't happening. Things were going along pretty smoothly, but then one of the people, not Tom, but another one, started to get suspicious of Chuck. And Chuck talked to the top people at the DNR. And at this point, there were only, as I said earlier, 5 or 6 people at the entire state of Michigan that knew of this undercover operation. And it was a good thing the undercover operation was such a tightly held secret, because as it turned out of the 54 people that ended up getting arrested in the mass sweep in January of 1979, some of them were related to other conservation officers. Some of them were related to county sheriffs, deputies, and word would have spread. And so Chuck and Rick went to the head of the DNR and said, we have to bring this to an end. So, as a result, they decided that they didn't have really any other choice but to do a simultaneous raid of everybody, because these guys were very talented. If a few got arrested, the evidence would have disappeared. So they pulled together all of these federal officers, DNR officers, 120 some DNR officers, local deputies that they trusted, state police, and they all assembled in one place and discussed how they were going to handle this mass arrest. They left the meeting, they spread out across the state of Michigan, and at the appointed time, at the early morning hours, 170 some law enforcement officers descended on all these 54 people that they arrested essentially simultaneously. That's where I got involved.
So this is January 20th, 1979, early morning hours, 54 arrests simultaneously across 6 Michigan counties.
Right.
Now, this could have been a lot larger. They probably could have busted a lot more people.
Oh, they could. Oh, probably 3 times to 4 times that many people.
But the 54 represented the top.
The top.
Okay.
The big shakers in the operation. The movers and the shakers.
That's a lot.
It is.
A lot of people.
It's a lot of people. There were 6 different stores that they arrested the owners of those stores, plus the taxidermist people, the hunters, the staging people that would gather these, the taxidermists, the fur buyers. And what we ended up with was the decision by the state of Michigan that they would handle kind of the showcase case in Ingham County. Even though that the people were being charged in other counties, they felt the best about Ingham County. And Ingham County, of course, is where the Michigan Attorney General's office is headquartered. And so they assigned this case to the head of the criminal division of the Michigan Attorney General's office and one of their senior prosecutors. And on, I think it was mid-April of 1979, we have our first court hearing. We have 15 defendants in this little courtroom. We have about a dozen defense attorneys, including myself. We have the undercover DNR officer, Chuck. We have the undercover Fed, Rick, in the courtroom. And we start the preliminary examination of this case.
So what happens during a preliminary examination?
Everyone is a little different. This one, what they do, and remember, this is a proceeding that is very different than a trial. This is very preliminary, and that's why they call it a preliminary examination. And as I'd indicated earlier, it is a time where law enforcement and the prosecutors need to show to a judge that the person that is in front of that judge more than likely committed the crime, that that crime had been committed in that jurisdiction. And if the judge finds that there is reason to believe that this person did the crime, did it in their jurisdiction, that judge then binds, is what they call it, binds the defendants over for trial in the circuit court. So all of these 15 defendants were charged, along with my guy, with misdemeanors and felonies. And the felony is what is the subject of the preliminary examination.
And each one of the other defendants had their own representation, right?
Well, yes, some of them actually shared an attorney. That's why there were 15 defendants and 12 defense attorneys.
Okay, but you solely represented Thomas.
I solely represented the ringleader.
Okay.
The entire time of this preliminary examination, my client is sitting right next to me. Now, to try to paint this picture, everybody has seen courtrooms on TV or in movies and so on, and there's usually a table for the defense attorney and the defendant, and there's a table for the prosecutor, or in this case, the attorney general. Remember, we had 15 defendants, 12 defense attorneys. We had attorneys sitting everywhere in that courtroom.
And courtrooms are not as big as people think they are. If you've never been in a courtroom, they're not that big.
They're not that big at all. So, because I was representing the ringleader, I was at the main defense attorney table with my client sitting next to me. And a couple of other attorneys shared that table. But we had attorneys sitting in the jury box. We had attorneys sitting in just chairs around the courtroom. We had attorneys and defendants sitting in the spectators' seats. Okay, I mean, courtrooms are just not built for that big of a case. So, but it was fortunate that I had the ability to, at least be at that table, kind of the main defensive table, because I was representing the ringleader. And there's nothing about real life court that's anywhere similar to what you see on TV in a movie. Okay, for the most part, they can be kind of boring, and you go through a lot of things that the rules of evidence require you to go through, which is kind of a strained way to do things. You can't just sit there and have a conversation, okay? There is questions and answers, there's objections, and so on and so forth. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, usually a preliminary examination will go in the range of a half a day, maybe a couple of hours. Maybe on a really big case, it would go for a day. This one went for 6 days. We were even there on Saturday. So, and along, we are listening to the undercover agent testify. And so a couple of days was just the Attorney General's office walking the witness, which is Chuck, the undercover DNR agent, conservation officer, asking him questions about what happened. So, what happened on this date? What happened on that date? What were you doing here? What were you doing there? What was Tom doing? What were all of these other people doing? And he would testify. After a couple of days of that...
So at this time, did they know that he was a conservation officer, or was he still kind of keeping up this whole...
No. By that time, the beard was gone. Even some of the weight was gone. He was in a suit and tie. He was the man. Okay. And sitting there on the witness stand, looking at all of these people that he had been buying and selling wild game to, formed relationships with. Now he's on the other side of the table, dishing the dirt out on them.
Wow.
Okay. And as a defense attorney, you have the advantage of having your client next to you, feeding you with information. Okay. So we have a couple of days where the Attorney General is asking the undercover agent these things. And both the Fed undercover agent testified, and Chuck, the DNR person, testified. But then the defense attorneys get a chance to cross-examine, to try to cast doubt on what these witnesses are saying and what this 4 or 5 inches of police reports are saying. And so, as we're going through this preliminary examination, I have my client sitting next to me, literally whispering in my ear, "Yeah, I did that. Yeah, I did that.
You really didn't have
I
any
did
doubt
that."
that he did that when you...
There was no question whatsoever. Yeah, this went on for a couple of days. And then, out of the blue, my client said, "I didn't do what he just said I did." And I'm thinking, right. Okay, for days I have been hearing this, and now you're telling me you didn't do this? That I just kind of blew it off. But at the next break, we go outside because there's no private room in that courthouse where I could talk to my client. So we literally went outside. And I said, "Okay, Tom, I've been sitting here for days and you've been saying, yeah, I did that. I did that. I did that. And now you're telling me you didn't do this one thing?" He said, "Not only did I not do it, I can prove I didn't do it." I'm going, "All right, Tom, how are you going to prove this?" Well, remember the story I told you about Onondaga and getting into the Grand River and floating from point A to point B 8 miles away and drifting with the current and getting out and having shot something like 20-some ducks? Well, he told me that story again. I said, "Yeah, that's what I heard in the courtroom. What about it?" He said, "It didn't happen. Because if you look, the Grand River flows the opposite direction. We could not have coasted or floated with the current from point A to point B because the current runs from point B to point A, and that fucking DNR officer is lying through his teeth," to give you a direct quote. So I go, I actually had a map in my car. I went out, got the map of Michigan, looked, found the Grand River, and the Grand River does. It starts down south and goes all the way to Lake Michigan. And it's flowing from central Michigan, or the middle part of Michigan, west to the Grand River. So my guy is telling me the truth, because the river flows that way, not what Chuck said in his testimony. I'm a young lawyer, and while I'm, probably pretty full of myself, at least I'm smart enough to seek out 3 of the other defense attorneys that had a number of years on me. And I went up to them and said, "I need to talk to you." So we go outside. So there's the 4 of us lawyers out there. And I said to them, I told them the story that Tom had just told me. And they just looked at me and went, "Do you know how big this is?" And I said, "I think I do." So we decided during because we're cross-examining Chuck now, that we had to lock that story in so there was no wiggle room. So we go back in the courtroom. And we walk through that whole episode with Chuck, that there is no question. They got in at point A, they floated with the current to point B, and shot ducks. He locked that right in. So the next break, I go up to the head of the criminal division of the Attorney General's office and said, "I need to talk to you." He said, "I'm busy. I said, "You want to talk to me?" And so with this kind of exasperated attitude, he and his younger assistant that he'd brought with him, we go out in the parking lot now. And I tell him, I don't know how much longer this is going to last, but you know that undercover officer is lying. And they went, bullshit. Okay, I mean, that was the first words out of their mouth. I said, no, and I can prove it. He said, oh, yeah, this should be good. What? So I told him the same story that Tom had told me and that I'd told the other attorneys. What did Chuck say that he did on the Grand River in Onondaga? In this kind of pissy voice, the Attorney General goes, well, they got in point A, floated down the river, shot ducks, got out to point B. I said, here's a map I had in my car. I've got it folded open to that area of Michigan. Do you know where the Grand River empties out in the Great Lakes? And they went, yeah, it's over on the west side into Lake Michigan someplace. I said, yeah. That means the current's going from this point westward, right? They went, yeah. Your guy just testified that they floated in the current and went from west to east, and the river doesn't go that way. The look on their face was priceless. Well, we got to go talk. They're gone for about an hour and a half. The judge is getting pissed because he's sitting there with nothing to do on a Saturday waiting for these attorneys. Finally, the Attorney General comes to me and says, we've got 27 misdemeanors against your guy and a felony. Tell you what we'll do. We'll dismiss the felony. We'll dismiss 26 of the 27 misdemeanors. Your guy will plead guilty to one misdemeanor with a fine, and he will forfeit his gun and his truck as forfeiture to the state of Michigan because they were used in the commission of a crime. I'm not sure where I got the guts to do this. And I said, no. And they just looked at me like, we're dismissing virtually everything. We're not going to give you the truck. We'll pay the fine, no jail time, and we'll give you the rifle. And that's it. They said, done. Within a month following that, the Department of Justice charged Chuck, the undercover DNR officer, with 8 felonies for filing false police reports.
Even if they weren't intentional, because he perjured himself, basically, that becomes record. Oh my gosh.
They, being the Attorney General's office, were so pissed that this case, where they had dragged 170 law enforcement officers into a giant raid, the biggest raid that they'd ever had in Michigan, had hundreds of thousands of dollars invested to this operation over almost 2 years, fell apart completely. They dismissed entirely. They dismissed, I think, against 10 of the 12 defendants in my case. And they dismissed, because remember there was over 50 that they arrested. Mm-hmm. They dismissed over 40 of those defendants with no charges whatsoever.
Wow.
And the undercover officer pled guilty to 2 felonies and went to prison.
Oh my gosh.
That, what we didn't know was the extent of either the mistake that the DNR officer was making, or that he had gotten so invested in this case because he had become one of them. And they all live a lie. And so whether or not he was lying or just honestly mistaken, we'll never know. But he did plead guilty to 2 felonies and went to prison.
Wow.
And the interesting part of all this was we had to go back to court. After the DNR agent was charged, because we still had some cleanup on the preliminary examination, so we had a little bit more court. And then finally, September of 1979, September 6th, my guy actually entered his guilty plea, lost his rifle, paid his fine, and walked out of the courthouse. And by that time, within 5 days later, September 11th, 1979, the undercover agent pled guilty to obstruction of justice, making false statements, with a maximum sentence of 2 years and a $15,000 fine. And the other charges were dropped. And this was all in federal court.
Oh my gosh.
So when I said at the beginning that it changed lives, it changed mine. I quit doing criminal cases. It changed the undercover agent because he went from a well-respected conservation officer to a convicted felon.
And probably was never able to come back from that and get a job like that.
But not with a record.
Yeah.
And I've actually spent a fair number of hours trying to track him down, looking for obituaries. I mean, this was 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. Okay.
About how old was he at that time?
I think he was in his 40s at that time.
Okay.
So statistically, he's probably passed away. I can't find an obituary. I can't find anything on him at all. What was really added insult to injury, Michigan has, and a lot of people, certainly of my age, remember Michigan Outdoors. It was a big television show. Mm-hmm. They had their own magazine. In April of 1979, Chuck, the undercover agent, sat down for an interview with the editor of Michigan Outdoors. And in the April 1979 edition, there was about a 6-page article talking about what a wonderful case this was, talked about all of the things that had happened and how big this poaching operation was. And
But that was before it went to preliminary hearing, right?
It was recorded, and the interview happened before the preliminary examination.
Is that even allowed? Like, can you do that?
Oh, yeah. He was just being interviewed. It was on the news. It was in the Detroit Free Press. Mm-hmm. It was in the Lansing papers. It was all over the place. Yeah. By the time this article actually hit the newsstands, we'd already discovered the problem with their case.
Amazing.
And their case had literally fallen apart, but the article still came out, making Officer look like a hero, telling this wonderful story, spread it out over 2 years of this Wildlife Mafia operation that all collapsed.
Did his time, got out, changed his name, and
very well could have.
So what became of Thomas? Was he ever charged with anything in any other counties? Or
He was. He ended up, because there was so much evidence from the feds, because remember, there was a federal officer undercover as well as the DNR person. So Tom, actually ended up being found guilty in federal court of a wild game charge, but he never served time.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. So what age was he back when this happened?
He was clearly in his 50s.
So he has probably passed away by now.
Undoubtedly.
Okay. Well, that blows my mind. So after this whole court fiasco happens, laws were changed on the state and federal level.
They were. They started having hearings in Congress about the deficiencies in the wild game laws. And that's why in 1980, a huge change happened on the federal level to tighten up and make it easier to prosecute.
Do you think there is a lot of poaching that still happens?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that is a case that absolutely blows my mind. To see that plot twist I did not see coming. So, how did this affect you as an attorney?
Well, like I said, I decided to quit doing criminal cases because, frankly, I was convinced that the undercover agent probably made an honest mistake.
Yeah.
And he had his life destroyed because of it.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to swallow. You kind of go, where's the justice in that? Right?
Exactly. I was fortunate because this was a big enough case that other defense attorneys were also involved in the case on behalf of other defendants. When you have the top people from the Attorney General's office, you've got really good lawyers. So I still learned a lot just being involved in this case. I mean, that's the nice thing about a lawyer is that you learn new stuff virtually every day.
Sure.
But this was something that opened my eyes to how big an operation this was. I mean, when you're talking about in today's dollars of people making close to $1 million on wild game.
Yeah. A year.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
And there's so much more to the story.
And I'm amazed just reading the paperwork that I read that, like you said, we kind of skimmed the top level of the story, but the relationships that evolved with Chuck being ingrained into this lifestyle. I mean, he was really entwined.
Oh, he was very entwined. And with the hunters, with the taxidermists, with the processors, with the people that sold. And it was the kind of thing that, he just kind of fell into that lifestyle. And today, I don't think they would ever put a person undercover with the lack of training that Chuck had to learn how to not fall into that lifestyle.
Yeah.
And he did. And it's a shame.
The service that they were providing by selling this meat to the inner city, essentially.
It was the inner city. To some extent. I'll talk about that in a minute, but go ahead.
These people were getting meat they wouldn't normally have been able to get because they weren't hunters. A lot of people that live in the inner city don't have the capability to leave and go hunting in the country. So in that aspect, it's sad that they're now not getting that. But
the ones that pissed me off, though, were the big rollers, as the people in the ring called them. And they repeatedly talked about doctors and they talked about lawyers.
Really?
Who would have wild game dinners and were some of their very best customers.
Wow. And they knew it was illegal?
Absolutely, they knew it was illegal.
For sure. So what happened to the meat after they got busted? All these freezers full of meat that he had.
That's a really good question. They never kept much on hand. I mean, you don't just stockpile it and hold on to it. You sell it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't know on the day of the bust how many hundreds of pounds or thousands of pounds of meat were confiscated. I never did see that. But it wouldn't surprise me that there were, a few thousand pounds. I mean, that's the kind of quantities that we're talking about. Chuck recites on a couple of occasions after the bust where his life was threatened by people in the Wildlife Mafia.
It was pretty scary.
It is scary.
Because, those people know where to hunt. They also know where to dispose of a body and how to easily dispose of a body to where you're never found.
Oh, I can guarantee it. And Chuck described many times in his police reports how these people that were the killers, as he called them, could literally sneak up on deer, and the deer would never hear them coming.
Wow, that's a talent.
These people were people that would sit in a truck, and from a distance of probably 50 to 75 feet, would use a .22 caliber rifle to shoot pheasants. Okay, most people shoot pheasants with a shotgun. These people were so good at what they did. A lot of them hunted with .22 caliber rifles and pistols. Some of them did it from horseback.
Oh my gosh.
Wild West.
It is serious talent. And so I am sure that there were many times when Chuck thought, I would never see it coming. I would never even hear the person coming up to take me out.
Did he have a family?
Yes, he had a wife and he had 2 kids.
Oh my gosh.
Did they have any idea that he was doing?
They knew he was undercover.
And did he go home to them at night or?
He would, but he ended up with a girlfriend.
Interesting.
Part of his cover, he would shack up in these no-tell motels, and even in the police reports, there are times where it slipped. There was one thing in the police report that actually talked about Chuck's girlfriend, but the amount of booze that they bought was huge. Okay, and I mean, they would literally just get together after work, go out hunting and drinking, and sometimes they would start on a Friday night, go out drinking, go out hunting, and never go to bed again until Sunday night. These were people you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley.
Wow. That's crazy. So did his wife find out that he had a girlfriend?
I don't know. I really don't. And I think you told me that you tried to do some research on the person. Mm-hmm. I've tried to do research on Chuck.
Yeah.
And I have not been able to find anything. I don't know if the feds finally decided to suppress his records so that he maybe could have a life afterwards after prison. I don't know what happened.
It could be. I was able to find things before, going back to like 1970 when he was a conservation officer.
Yep.
And talking about other things. And then kind of nothing after this case about him. There was nothing about him being charged.
It's like he disappeared.